Barkley Brookers, welcome to week 2 of distance learning. I have a special story for you to start this week. If you think back to when we were doing our Caldecott project, you remember I mentioned when we were reading Finding Winnie that sometimes the best stories are true stories. So I have another true story for you. Has a couple connections to that Finding Winnie story. I'm going back and forth on whether to let you figure out the connections yourself. Actually, I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to see if you can spot the connections and comment them in the comment section. So let's see how many, because there's a bunch. There's probably a good 4 or 5 different connections at least between this story and the Finding Winnie. So this story is called Fairy Spell: How Two Girls Convince the World That Fairies Are Real. It's written by Mark Tyler Nobleman and illustrated by Eliza Wheeler. Now, it is illustrated by Eliza Wheeler, so the drawings are by Eliza Wheeler, but then you'll see that there are some historical photographs sprinkled throughout as well, and those are really cool to see. I do want to give you a suggestion because what the two girls in the story do is really, really cool. It's a great idea. It might be something you want to try. Today's not the greatest day to do it outside like these girls did because of the weather. Obviously, it's rainy and yucky and pretty horrible outside, but it is something you could try inside. But please, 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 and we will make sure that mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, auntie, uncle, babysitter, whoever's home with you during your distance learning experience today knows that I said this. Do not go poking holes in your furniture in order to recreate what these girls do in the story. But I would love for you to share anything that you tried out on your own to recreate what the girls do. Okay, so here is Fairy Spell. Yet again, 9-year-old Frances Griffiths had fallen into the water. Her expensive shoes were soaking wet. Her mother was furious. Her Aunt Polly asked, "Why do you keep going to the beck?" Frances paused. "To see the fairies." "Fairies? Nonsense," said her Uncle Arthur. Frances and her mother had moved to South Africa to Cottingley, England, while Frances's father was serving in World War I. They were staying with the Wrights, her aunt, uncle, and 16-year-old cousin Elsie. Frances and Elsie, both only children, had become like sisters. Okay, so here are Annie and Frances, and that's their father who's serving in World War I. And they're from South Africa, and while the father was serving, they came to live with their relatives in England. And this is Aunt Polly, and this is Cousin Elsie, and that's Uncle Arthur. And here are the girls. Elsie is the older one, and Frances is younger. The Wright home sat on the highest point in the village. Behind it stretched a garden, and burbling at the bottom of the garden was a beck, or stream. Throughout the summer of 1917, the beck had called to Frances and Elsie, and they spent many happy hours there. Though it was mere yards from the house, they sometimes brought lunch so they wouldn't have to leave for any longer than necessary. So here's the house here, and this is the stream, or beck. They call it the beck. Here it is, and they're walking across. And that's probably how she fell in and got her shoes all wet. But that day, Frances was on the verge of tears because the adults did not believe her fairy tale. Elsie said to her father, "If you'll let me have your camera and tell me how it works, I'll get a photo of the fairies." Photography was new enough that many people had never taken a picture. Cameras could be complicated to use. Arthur said no. The girls pleaded with him for days. One July afternoon, he finally agreed. He supplied them with 1 plate, meaning they could take only 1 picture. Less than an hour later, they reappeared with knowing smiles. So that's the camera right there. "We've got the photo, I believe," Elsie said. "Will you look?" She squeezed into their small dark room with her father while Frances waited outside. Arthur began to develop the photo. As the image took shape, He thought he was looking at birds or sandwich wrappers, and then he saw legs and arms, tiny ones. "The fairies are on the plate!" Elsie shouted to Francis, who squealed and danced on the other side of the door. Arthur was speechless, and then he laughed. He felt Francis and Elsie were playing a joke, but the girls swore they did only as they said they would, prove that fairies frolicked at the back. "If anybody else were there, the fairies would not come out," Elsie said. "The fairies wouldn't come out for you in 100 years. The adults could not figure out how or if they were being fooled. Okay, so let me explain to you a little bit about photography in 1917. So this is a picture, a drawing of the darkroom. So back when photography was first invented, so right now when we take a picture on our phone or on a Polaroid, it comes out right away. On our phone or on most of our cameras, it's digital. So we capture that image, and it's our phone and our camera even is like a tiny little computer, and the image is captured. But back then, it wasn't. It was captured onto a plate. And then they would use chemicals to develop. So not a plate like a plate where you eat your food, but a plate that would slide into the back of the camera. And then with chemicals, it would trap using the light. It would trap the image. And then with chemicals, with more chemicals, you would develop that picture. But it had to be done in the dark, and it had to be done in a very special way. Otherwise, you would ruin the picture. So that's what they're doing here. So when she said the fairies are on the plate, she didn't mean like on the plate of food. She meant they're on the plate like the photograph. And so here is that first picture that the girls took. And there's Francis, and there's the fairies. In September, Arthur again loaned Francis and Elsie his camera. Again, the girls scurried to the beck for a short while, and again they scrambled back with a photo the adults could not believe. Elsie holding hands with a gnome. This time, Arthur was more annoyed than amused. The girls still would not confess, so Arthur forbade them from using his camera. But Polly had quietly begun to feel that somehow the girls were telling the truth. On November 9th, 1918, Francis sent a friend in South Africa a letter and enclosed one of the fairy photographs. On the back of the photo, she wrote, "Elsie and I are very friendly with the Beck fairies. It is funny, I never used to see them in Africa. It must be too hot for them there." And so Aunt Polly is starting to believe the girls. And here's the second picture. Francis holding hands with one of the gnomes. Oh, Elsie holding hands with a gnome. 2 days later, World War I ended. Francis's father returned, and the Griffiths family moved to Scarborough, a town about 2 hours from Cottingley. The following summer, the girls' mothers attended a lecture on fairies. Polly showed the speaker the photos Francis and Elsie had taken and asked, "Are fairies really true?" And so the war is over, and the father comes home. So now the families are gonna live separately. They're like 2 hours away. News of the photo spread to Edward Gardner, a man well known for speaking on topics of the supernatural, and then to Arthur Conan Doyle, the author who created the world-famous detective Sherlock Holmes. Here's Edward Gardner and Arthur Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle was no stranger to the possibility of fairies. His father said he often saw them. Intrigued, Gardner and Conan Doyle decided to investigate the photos together. For Conan Doyle, the timing was apt. He had already been preparing to write about fairies for The Strand, a popular British magazine. Gardner visited the Wrights in Cottingley. He said that Conan Doyle would like to publish the photos with his article. Although Elsie and her parents turned him down at first, they eventually agreed, so long as the magazine did not print their real names or identify their village. Gardner asked Harold Snelling, a photographer with 30 years of experience, to examine the photos. Snelling said, "This is the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen." In fact, Snelling believed that while the photo was being taken, the fairies had moved. If they moved, they must be real. And if the girls had taken 2 photos, they could take more. Frances was sent to Cottingley so the girls could go out to the beck to summon or tice, as they said, the fairies, short for entice, meaning to to get them to come, to entice. But it rained every day. In the 2 weeks Frances was in Cottingley, the girls got only 2 hours of sunshine to try for photos. But on August 26, 1920, they managed to take 2 pictures. And on August 28th, 1 more. The 5th and final photo had no Frances or Elsie, only fairies and something else. But not even the girls could say what it was. It looked like a cocoon made of grass. Conan Doyle called it a fairy sunbath. He and Gardner were ready to publish their story. So there are the photographs. Looks like that one is Elsie, and that one is Frances. And there's the one that's the fairy sunbath. The girls' first 2 photos appeared in the December 1920 issue of The Strand. The magazine called them the 2 most astounding photographs ever published. In Conan Doyle's article, Frances was Alice and Elsie was Iris. So while the girls kept their privacy, their nameless friends from the beck were introduced to the public. The issue sold out in 3 days. Everyone was aflutter about the fairy photos. While some readers thought the girls had made a historic discovery, others thought the photos were fake and couldn't grasp how a smart man like Arthur Conan Doyle could believe they were real. These are actual covers of the magazines, and that is a picture of the actual article. Some doubters pointed out that the waterfall behind Frances was blurry, but the fairies were not. If both the water and the fairies were moving, both should be blurry. Others questioned why Frances was looking at the camera rather than the fanciful fairies. Conan Doyle said the wings were not blurred because fairies is a combination of human and butterfly whose body doesn't work like those of either humans or butterflies. Gardner said Frances was not looking at the fairies because she was used to them. What she was not used to was the camera. But the main reason the 2 men felt the photos were truthful was because the 2 girls came from decent families and had no history of hoaxing. A few months later, under the headline, "The Evidence for Fairies," The Strand ran Frances and Elsie's last 3 photos. So here, if you look carefully, here's the waterfall. And it's blurry because it's moving, and they're saying, how come the waterfall's blurry but their wings are not? A reporter found out that Alice and Iris were really Frances and Elsie. The attention soon became so overwhelming that the girls were eager to say farewell to fairies. Besides, they were growing up. Elsie married in 1926 and Frances in 1928. They had children, got jobs, and settled in different parts of England. People stopped bothering them until 1965. Sorry about that, my friends, but the phone does ring sometimes while we're in the library, doesn't it? So there they are with their own families. A journalist tracked down Elsie, then 64 years old. The fairy photo frenzy started all over again. "Let's say they are figments of our imaginations," Frances said mine, "and leave it at that," Elsie said. Some people took that to mean that the girls made up the fairies. Others thought that clever Elsie was not admitting anything one way or the other. "What did you say that for?" Frances, then 58 years old, wrote in a letter to Elsie. "You know very well they were real." In 1976, a TV show filmed Frances and Elsie returning to Cottingley together for the first time since the 1920s. They did not see fairies. Possibly, they said, only children can. The next year, an author named Fred Gettings was doing research for a book he was writing about old illustrations. Looking through Princess Mary's gift book, which had been published in 1914, he was startled by what he saw on page 104, a drawing of fairies accompanying a poem called A Spell for a Fairy. Those fairies looked almost identical to the ones in Frances and Elsie's first photo. But it wasn't till 6 years later that the puzzle of the Cottingley fairies was solved. Mostly. In 1983, when Elsie was 81 and Frances was 75, Elsie revealed that they had indeed faked the photos. Elsie had wanted to get back at the adults for scolding Frances when she came home drenched. Because Frances was younger, she went along with Elsie's plan. Elsie copied the fairies from Princess Mary's gift book onto stiff paper and cut them out. The girls attached long pins to the backs of the drawings and stuck them into the ground or to branches. After they snapped the photos, they ripped up the cutouts and scattered the pieces into the beck. All those years earlier, Arthur had looked for but had failed to find such scraps. Neither girl could have had any idea that a backyard prank on their parents would blow up into a front-page prank on the world. Here's the illustration of them taking the picture. That's Elsie taking the picture of Frances, that first one. I can't understand why people were taken in, Frances said. They wanted to be taken in. Frances and Elsie kept the secret almost their whole lives. Even their parents had never learned what they'd done. Part of the reason the girls did not want to divulge the truth earlier was to spare Conan Doyle and Gardner any embarrassment. But by 1983, both had passed away. However, while Frances admitted the first 4 photos were frauds, she disagreed with Elsie about that last, the photo of the fairy sunbath. Frances insisted it was the world's first photo of actual fairies. Frances was not especially concerned with whether or not people believed that the photo was real. Shortly before she died, she made clear what she most wanted people to know, to remember, to believe. There were fairies at Cottingley. And then there's an author's note in the back that talks about the fairies and everything. But whether or not the fairies were real is still up for debate. The photographs, both of the girls admitted were fakes, that they had faked, except for that last one. Elsie says that the last one, was it Frances? I always mix the two up. Frances said the last one definitely was real, but you really can't make out what was in that last one. But she says the fairies were real all along. Elsie came up with this idea, this plan to make these fake photos to get back at the adults because they didn't believe Frances. Frances still swore all the way up to her dying day that the fairies were real. The photographs were not. So, what do you think, my friends? Are fairies real?